I thought life was good, better than good even. Sarah, my wife of 5 years, was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. We were married young, and in those years I'd grown used to the way she made me feel like the luckiest guy in the world. But around her 28th birthday, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing you could put a finger on. Just a nagging feeling in my gut. She seemed distant, checking her phone at odd times, keeping it close to her, even during those quiet moments when we'd sit down for dinner after a long day. The strange behavior started to sink in one morning, when she left the house before dawn without saying a word. I'd barely registered the sound of the door closing behind her when I heard the car start up and pull away, leaving me staring into the dark, wondering what could be so urgent. Yoga, maybe? An early meeting? I decided not to say anything about it. After all, everyone goes through weird phases, right? But the next few weeks only got stranger. One night she returned from what she said was a quick grocery run. Over 2 hours later. When I asked about it, she brushed it off with a quick excuse. Traffic was a nightmare, she'd said with a tired sigh, eyes flitting away from mine. But at nearly 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night? Then, she started mentioning how it'd be so nice if we could spend time at my dad's house while our own place was being renovated. I'd been putting off the renovations for months. Money was tight, sure, but I sensed that wasn't her real concern. What was the rush? It seemed out of nowhere, but after weeks of her casually bringing it up, I finally agreed. And that's how we found ourselves spending the next few months at my father's place. In some ways, it was convenient. Dad was generous about giving us space, and he even seemed thrilled to have us around. He was recently widowed, and I guess the empty nest had hit him harder than he let on. Sarah seemed to go out of her way to make him feel included, joking with him, bringing him his favorite snacks, and asking about old family stories I'd heard 100 times. The dad charm wore thin for me, but Sarah seemed entertained by it all. One evening, a few weeks after we moved in, I came home from work a little earlier than usual. As I stepped through the door, I called out, expecting to hear a reply from Sarah or Dad. Instead, I was greeted with silence, unsettling and total. I walked through the house, calling out for them. Sarah? Dad? My voice echoed through the halls, unanswered. When I reached the den, I paused at the doorway. Something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the feeling made the hairs on my neck stand up. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter coming from upstairs. It was faint, but it was definitely Sarah's voice, and my dad's. Curious, I took a few quiet steps toward the staircase, straining to catch snippets of the conversation. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that I was being paranoid. But the closer I got, the more I could hear the faint murmurs of voices, too soft to make out the words but just loud enough to keep me inching forward, like my feet had a mind of their own. I stopped dead in my tracks halfway up the stairs, my heart pounding. I don't know what I expected to find as I crept up the stairs. Maybe they were talking about something personal. Or maybe they were just having a laugh, reminiscing about a family story I'd somehow missed. But nothing could have prepared me for what I actually saw. I took another quiet step, peeking around the corner into a hallway that led to my dad's bedroom. And there they were, my father and Sarah. But they weren't talking. They weren't laughing. They were wrapped around each other. My breath caught, and I froze, struggling to comprehend the scene in front of me. My father's hand was tangled in Sarah's hair, and she was smiling, no, laughing, her face pressed close to his. I couldn't believe it, refused to believe it. This had to be some kind of mistake, a trick of the light, a nightmare I'd wake up from any second. But as I stood there, hidden in the shadows, it became painfully clear that this was real. Too real. I stumbled back, catching myself against the wall to keep from collapsing. I wanted to scream, to storm into the room and demand an explanation. But something held me back. My mind was racing, too flooded with disbelief and anger to process a single thought clearly. My own wife. With my father. I barely remember leaving the house. I must have walked out as quietly as I'd walked in, my brain running on autopilot, pulling me toward the car. When I finally got in and shut the door, I just sat there, staring blankly out the windshield, struggling to understand what I just witnessed. The shock began to melt away, replaced by something else, something darker. Anger? No, it was beyond anger. It was rage, a kind of boiling fury that was almost too much to contain. I clenched my hands around the steering wheel, white-knuckled, my mind running through every possible way I could make them both pay. I drove around aimlessly for hours, the images replaying in my mind over and over, each memory as fresh and painful as if I were seeing it for the first time. How long had this been going on? How could they do this to me? Every thought spiraled into the next, filling me with a twisted desire for revenge, something that would make them feel the same betrayal that was tearing me apart from the inside. By the time I returned to the house, it was well past midnight. The lights were off, and the house was quiet, almost peaceful. But the peace didn't reach me. I was already planning my next move. My dad had condoms in the bathroom cabinet. He kept them there, hidden but accessible. And as I stared at them, the pieces of a scheme started to come together in my mind. It was petty, yes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a needle from the sewing kit in the laundry room and got to work, puncturing each condom, one by one, letting the fury fuel me as I worked. The idea felt satisfying, like the start of some twisted justice. It wouldn't be enough, no, nothing could make up for the betrayal I'd just experienced, but it was a start. The next morning, I was bleary-eyed and exhausted, but I forced myself to act normal. If Sarah or my father suspected anything, they didn't show it. She was humming to herself as she made coffee, acting like the same cheerful, loving wife she'd always pretended to be. I watched her, feeling the bile rise in my throat as she poured my dad a cup and slid it across the counter with a familiar smile. They shared a glance, a small, fleeting look that could have meant anything, but now, it felt like 1,000 knives twisting in my chest. "Morning, Dad," I managed to say, keeping my tone steady. He looked up, a little startled but perfectly casual, like nothing had happened. "Hey, son. Didn't see you come home last night." "Yeah, I went for a drive," I replied, my voice tight. "Cleared my head." The words were simple enough, but as I watched them together, I felt my resolve harden. My little condom trick was just the beginning. They had no idea I knew. If they were going to keep playing this sick game, I'd play right along, for now. Over the next few days, I began to notice more signs that I'd missed before. A touch that lingered a little too long. A quick, shared glance when they thought I wasn't looking. I felt like I was living in a different reality, a warped version of my own life where nothing was real, and everything was a lie. But then something happened that turned everything upside down. One afternoon, I got a call from my friend Mark. We'd been close since high school, the kind of friend who always knew how to pull me out of a funk when things got tough. I answered, trying to keep my tone light, but the heaviness of the last few days must have shone through because the first thing he said was, "You all right, man? You sound off." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, forcing a chuckle. "Just a long week." "Tell me about it," he replied, sounding distracted. "By the way, did your dad mention anything to you?" I frowned, thrown off. "About what?" "Emma's pregnancy," he said, with a casualness that left me frozen. Emma, Mark's wife, was one of Sarah's closest friends. "I figured your dad would have told you by now. He seemed pretty excited when I ran into him yesterday." My head was spinning. I hadn't heard a word about Emma's pregnancy. And why would my father, of all people, know before I did? "Oh, yeah, right," I said, scrambling for a response. "Just slipped my mind, I guess." When I hung up, my hands were shaking. What was my dad doing talking to Mark's wife in the first place? And why would he be the one to break news like that to me? A dark thought crossed my mind. I had only just started to uncover this mess, but it seemed deeper and uglier than I'd realized. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My father and Sarah's betrayal was more than an affair. They were tangled up in parts of my life I hadn't even noticed. I kept replaying Mark's words about my father and Emma. What business did he have getting so close to her? How long had this twisted web been spinning around me without my seeing it? I decided I'd watch them more closely. I didn't have a plan beyond that, but I knew I couldn't let on that I was aware. If they felt safe, maybe they'd slip up again, give me more insight into how long this betrayal had been going on, and how deep it ran. That night, I forced myself to act normal. I went to bed as usual, laying next to Sarah, while my mind churned with questions. She reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. Instead, I laced my fingers with hers, whispering goodnight, pretending to be the husband she still thought I was. The words tasted bitter on my tongue, but I swallowed them down. Over the next few days, I kept my distance, observing them both with a silent rage simmering just beneath the surface. And then, one evening, I caught them slipping away into the den together, where they thought they had privacy. I followed, staying just out of sight, and listened in, my heart pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. "Are you sure he hasn't noticed anything?" My father's voice was low, cautious. Sarah gave a quiet laugh. "He's so busy with work, he barely looks up half the time. Trust me, he has no idea." Hearing her say that, so casually, so confidently, was like a punch to the gut. The betrayal hit me in waves, each one harder than the last. I clenched my fists, gripping the doorframe to keep from charging in and confronting them. But I knew better than to let my anger control me. Not yet. Just then, they moved toward the stairs, and I ducked out of sight. Sarah was heading back up to bed, and I realized my window was closing. If I wanted to see this through, I had to keep my cool. I had to bide my time and wait for the right moment. But as the days dragged on, the pressure built up, eating away at me from the inside. And when I caught my father slipping Sarah a wink over breakfast one morning, something snapped. I couldn't take the charade another second. I forced a smile, trying to hide the anger in my voice as I looked at my father. "Hey, Dad," I began, keeping my tone light. "Mark mentioned you ran into him the other day. Said you were talking about Emma's pregnancy?" His fork paused midair, and a flash of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by something guarded. "Oh, yeah? Just ran into him by chance," he said with a casual shrug. "No big deal." But I could see the lie in his eyes. I'd known my father too long to miss it. There was something more there, something he was hiding. And Sarah, she kept her gaze firmly on her plate, avoiding my eyes altogether. I wanted to scream, to force them both to come clean, but I held back. Let them think they were safe, I told myself. Because when this was all over, they'd never see it coming. The days passed in slow torture, each one filled with moments that deepened my anger, but I stayed silent, keeping up appearances while I planned my next move. I'd already tampered with the condoms my dad kept in his bathroom, childish, maybe, but somehow it felt like a first strike, a way of seizing back some control. Yet, it wasn't nearly enough. I needed something bigger, something that would shake them both to the core. One night, I found myself alone at the house. Sarah had gone to run errands, a vague excuse I barely questioned anymore, and Dad was out at one of his poker nights. I sat there, thinking about the twisted family dynamic I was trapped in, when I remembered the box of my dad's things in the attic, a collection of personal junk he'd saved over the years. I climbed up to the attic and searched through it, my hands digging through dusty albums, a few keepsakes from my late mom, and finally, an old spare phone he'd used years ago. The sight of the phone gave me an idea. What if I could make it look like he'd left incriminating evidence lying around? Something I could show to Sarah later or, if it came to it, show to his poker buddies, people who looked up to him as some respectable family man. I pocketed the phone, a new plan forming in my mind. I'd set it up with fake messages, suggesting he'd been seeing other women, maybe even Sarah's best friend, Emma. The seed of revenge was planted, and I felt that dark satisfaction creep in again. But I knew I had to be careful. One wrong move, and they'd catch on. A few days later, I overheard my father talking on the phone, something about stopping by to see Emma and how they needed to talk. I gritted my teeth, doing my best to act like I hadn't heard. After he left, I paced the empty house, thoughts racing. If I was going to expose them both, I needed proof they couldn't wriggle out of. And now I had a new angle. I just had to bide my time and wait for the right moment to strike. That evening, Sarah came home, and I watched her carefully, noting the way she barely glanced in my direction. I couldn't help myself. I had to test the waters. "So, how was your day?" I asked, my voice as casual as I could make it. She shrugged, barely looking up. "Just errands, the usual." But something in her voice seemed off, a little too dismissive. "Seeing anyone interesting these days?" I asked, throwing out the bait. She hesitated, just a flicker of it, before she looked at me and forced a smile. "Just the usual people." The lie was there, and I could see it plain as day. The tension in the house was thick, almost suffocating. I could see it in the way Sarah avoided me, glancing away every time I looked at her too long, and in the way my dad seemed to avoid being in the same room as me for too long. It was like they sensed something had shifted. Maybe I wasn't as good at hiding my anger as I thought. But that was fine. Let them feel uneasy. It was a taste of what was coming. I couldn't shake the idea of using my father's phone as a weapon. With a little digging and a few messages from a throwaway number, I could make it look like he'd been more entangled with Sarah's friend Emma than even he realized. I crafted the messages carefully, making sure they hinted at meetups and special talks that were innocent enough to pass for real conversations but with just enough innuendo to raise questions. If Sarah found those, she might begin to doubt him, maybe even confront him, and that's when I'd be ready to move in. A few days later, I overheard Sarah talking on the phone in our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and her voice was low, almost whispering. "Yes, I know, but he's been different lately," she was saying. I felt my stomach twist as I leaned in closer to hear. There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end. Then she sighed, sounding almost regretful. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. It's starting to feel wrong." "Wrong?" I whispered to myself, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe she was coming to her senses. But then I heard her next words. "I'll see you tomorrow, okay? We'll talk more then." She hung up, and I backed away from the door just in time to avoid being caught. So, she had no plans to stop, after all. Whatever glimmer of hope I'd felt was snuffed out in an instant, replaced by a renewed sense of betrayal. She was still meeting with him, still going behind my back with my own father. I clenched my fists, fighting to keep the fury from showing on my face. That night, as we lay in bed, I watched her from the corner of my eye. She was asleep, or at least pretending to be, her breathing deep and even. But I couldn't close my eyes, couldn't shake the anger burning inside me. I thought about everything they'd done, all the lies, the betrayal. And that's when an idea hit me, something more final, more damning than anything I'd considered before. I'd confront them both. I'd force them to face me, to explain themselves, to look me in the eye and tell me why they thought they could do this. But I wouldn't do it here, in our house. No, I'd wait until they were together, somewhere they thought they were safe. The trap was set. All I needed was for them to walk into it. The next morning, I felt a sense of clarity. I knew what had to be done, and there was no turning back now. My patience had paid off. I'd overheard my father telling Sarah he'd meet her that evening, at his office downtown, a quiet place where they thought they'd have complete privacy. Little did they know, I'd be there waiting for them. I took my time that day, going about my usual routine, letting them think I was oblivious. When evening came, I told Sarah I'd be working late. She barely batted an eye, just murmured an "okay," without even looking up from her phone. The indifference stung, but it only fueled my determination. I arrived at my dad's office before they did, slipping into the dimly lit hallway just outside his door. My heart pounded as I hid, listening for the sound of their voices. I didn't have to wait long. Soon enough, I heard footsteps, followed by muffled laughter that made my skin crawl. They stepped into the office, closing the door behind them, unaware of my presence just a few feet away. I waited a moment, gathering myself, then slowly turned the knob and opened the door just enough to peer inside. They were standing close, too close. My dad's hand was on her arm, his voice low and warm as he whispered something that made her smile. My stomach churned at the sight, and I felt my hands clench into fists. I pushed the door open wider, stepping into the room. The sound caught their attention, and they both froze, turning to face me with wide eyes. The shock on their faces was almost satisfying, but the pain and betrayal overpowered any sense of victory. "Mind telling me what's going on?" I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Sarah's face went pale, and she stumbled over her words, unable to find an excuse. My father, on the other hand, straightened up, his expression shifting from shock to something almost defiant. "Son, this isn't what you think," he started, but I cut him off. "Don't lie to me," I said, stepping closer. "I've seen everything. I know exactly what's been going on between you two." The room was silent, filled with the tension of everything left unsaid. I could feel the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me, suffocating, but I held myself together. I wanted them to feel the shame, the guilt of what they'd done. "You had every chance to come clean," I continued, my voice shaking slightly. "But you kept lying, kept pretending like everything was normal. Did you think I was that blind?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. "I don't want to hear your excuses," I said, cutting her off. "I want you both out of my life. You can have each other if that's what you want. But I'm done." With that, I turned and walked out of the office, leaving them both behind. I could hear Sarah calling my name, her voice breaking, but I didn't look back. Leaving them behind felt liberating, like a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying was finally lifted. The drive back to the house was a blur, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, a strange calm had washed over me. I'd taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, and there was no going back. The next morning, I made arrangements to leave. There was nothing left for me in that house or in this town, just bitter memories and reminders of betrayal. I called a real estate agent, put the house up for sale, and began packing my things. Sarah tried calling me, leaving messages, even showing up at the house to explain. Each time, I ignored her, steeling myself against her pleas. She had made her choices. She could live with the consequences. Eventually, I heard from mutual friends that she'd moved in with my dad. The thought stung, but it also reinforced my decision. They were each other's problem now. A few weeks later, I finalized my divorce, signed the papers without a second thought, and left the city. The process was surprisingly quick, almost too easy. But I didn't question it. I just wanted to be free. I moved to a smaller city a few hours away, somewhere quiet where no one knew me. Starting over was hard, but it felt like a new chance, one I was determined to make the most of. I threw myself into my work, kept busy, and slowly began to rebuild. The pain lingered, but with each passing day, it dulled, becoming just a memory. Then, out of the blue, I received a call from an old friend who still lived in my hometown. He hesitated on the phone, as though unsure whether to tell me, but finally, he did. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Your dad, he left her." I was stunned. I hadn't heard a word from Sarah or my dad since I'd left, hadn't thought about their situation in weeks. I asked him to explain, and he filled me in. Apparently, not long after I moved, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. My father initially tried to make it work with her, but as soon as he found out, he left her without a word, moved out of town entirely, leaving her alone with a child on the way. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't bring myself to. She'd made her bed, and now she'd have to lie in it, alone. And as for me? I felt free. The news about Sarah's pregnancy and my father's abandonment took a few days to sink in. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, maybe even some twisted sense of justice, but what hit me instead was relief. A strange, unexpected relief. For the first time since this all began, it truly felt over. My new life started to fall into place after that. I threw myself into work, made friends, found hobbies I'd neglected over the years. There was something powerful about building a life that had nothing to do with Sarah, my father, or the painful memories they left behind. Slowly, I felt myself letting go of the resentment, the bitterness that had haunted me since the moment I'd discovered their betrayal. Months passed, and with each passing day, the anger that had once consumed me dulled. I even started dating again, nothing serious at first, just casual dinners and coffee dates. It felt strange, awkward even, but it was a step forward, a way to remind myself that life didn't end with Sarah's betrayal. In fact, it felt like a new beginning. One evening, while out at a local bookstore, I bumped into someone who would change everything, Lisa. She was flipping through a travel guide, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, a quiet smile on her face as she read. We started talking, first about travel, then about work, life, the small things you share when you first meet someone. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people genuinely enjoying each other's company. Our connection was easy, natural. And before I knew it, one coffee turned into dinner, then a second date, and a third. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet joy that came from just being with someone without the shadows of the past lurking in the background. Lisa knew about my past. I didn't hide it from her. She listened, sympathized, but never pitted me. She just understood. We laughed together, shared stories, made plans, and with each day, I found myself healing in ways I hadn't thought possible. One evening, as we sat on her porch, watching the sunset, Lisa took my hand and looked at me with a gentle smile. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice soft. And in that moment, I realized that I was too. The darkness of the past was still there, but it felt smaller, like something I could look back on without anger or regret. Sarah and my father were part of a life I'd left behind, and the freedom I'd found was worth every painful step I'd taken to get here. I'd moved on. With Lisa, every day felt like a second chance. She was warm, grounded, and honest in a way that was almost disarming. We spent countless hours exploring the city, sharing stories over late-night dinners, and venturing into the countryside on the weekends. She had an energy that was both calming and invigorating, reminding me what it felt like to truly enjoy life. One evening, as we were watching a movie at her place, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen. It was Sarah. Just her name, staring back at me, with a message that I had no desire to open. I hadn't heard from her in months, hadn't seen a trace of her since moving away. For a moment, a flicker of curiosity surfaced, but I quickly swiped it away, letting her message fade into the background. Whatever she had to say, it didn't matter anymore. That chapter of my life was closed. Lisa must have noticed something in my expression because she looked over, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "You don't have to carry that with you," she said softly, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. And she was right. I didn't have to carry it. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, I'd felt them all, but they no longer controlled me. Sarah's choices, my father's betrayal, they were part of my story, but they weren't my story. They didn't define who I was or where my life was headed. A few weeks later, I got a promotion at work, something I hadn't even realized I was striving for in all the chaos of rebuilding. Lisa was the first person I told, and we celebrated that night, laughing and toasting to new beginnings. She surprised me with a small gift, a keychain engraved with the words, "Keep moving forward." It was simple but perfect, a reminder of how far I'd come. A few months later, I asked Lisa to move in with me. It felt like the right step, something that symbolized everything I'd built since the wreckage of my past. She agreed, and as we started building our life together, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been missing all along, a love that was genuine, built on trust and kindness, free from the shadows of betrayal. Sarah and my father had tried to break me, but in the end, they'd only pushed me toward the life I was meant to live. And as I looked over at Lisa, laughing beside me, I knew that I'd found something even more precious than revenge or closure. I'd found freedom, happiness, and someone who loved me for exactly who I was. I'd moved on, and I was finally at peace. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.